The door sealed behind me before I had chosen a single question. That was my first mistake. In 100 interrogations before this one, I always walked in already knowing my opening line. This time the lock clicked shut and my mind was empty, and the human sitting across the table was already watching me the way you watch someone who has forgotten their own name. His name was Cole Bennett. I had read his file twice on the transport ride over and I still did not believe it. 23 years old by his species count. 3 confirmed engagements on the Threl border. Not one armed opponent who chose to stand against him directly had walked away. The file called him efficient. The file did not explain why his hands were folded so gently on the table, like a man waiting for tea. "You're nervous," he said, before I had even sat down fully. "That's smart. I am Vashtek Orhal-Dree. At the time, I was a junior intelligence officer for the Korvathi Joint Command, assigned to debrief prisoners taken during exchange negotiations. I had interviewed pirates who wept. I had interviewed fanatics who spat at the glass. I had interviewed a Threl commander who tried to bargain with me using coordinates that turned out to be fake. I had never once interviewed someone who looked at me like he was worried about my evening. My superiors had given me this assignment because I was good at reading discomfort. Species lie differently. A Threl soldier under pressure tightens around the eyes. A Korvathi liar overcorrects with eye contact, holds it too long. The way a person holds a smile after the joke has already died. I had built an entire early career on knowing what fear looked like on a face that was not my own. I had never built a framework for what calm looked like on a face that should have been afraid, and that gap in my training would follow me for the next 30 years. I placed my recorder on the table between us and pressed the activation panel. The small light turned green. I asked him to state his name and unit for the record, and he did. Calmly, in a voice with no accent I recognized from any human broadcast I had studied. Midwestern, my notes would later say. A region on a continent, on a planet most of the galaxy still could not find on a star chart without help. "Why did you fight at the Threl crossing?" I asked. "Orders," he said. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I'm allowed to give you." He tilted his head slightly. "You want to know if I enjoyed it?" I had not asked that question, but it was, in fact, the question underneath all my other questions. I said nothing, which he seemed to understand as confirmation, and he shook his head once. "No," he said. "I didn't." I had read enough soldier psychology reports from a dozen species to know what denial usually sounded like. Denial was loud. Denial protested too much, or it went cold and distant, building a wall between the person and the thing they had done. Cole Bennett did neither. He said the words the way a person reports the weather. Flat, final, already filed away somewhere he did not plan to revisit in front of me. I asked him about troop numbers. He gave me nothing useful, which I expected, and which was, oddly, reassuring. At least that part of him behaved like a soldier was supposed to behave. "How many ships did your unit have in reserve during the crossing?" I asked. I wasn't told. "You expect me to believe that?" "I expect you to believe whatever you want," he said, not unkindly. "I'm telling you the truth because lying to you takes effort, and I'm tired." That answer unsettled me more than a refusal would have. A trained operative refuses information with confidence, with a small performance of loyalty meant to be noticed and respected by whoever is watching the recording later. Cole Bennett did not perform anything. He simply declined to know things, the way a person declines a meal they are not hungry for. I changed direction and asked him about the human chain of command above his unit, the officers who gave the orders he claimed to be following. He answered 3 questions about rank structure with textbook precision, the kind of answer that comes from a briefing memorized rather than lived, and then went quiet on the 4th question, the one about where those officers received their own orders from. "I don't have clearance for that," he said. "You're a junior soldier. Why would you need clearance for the structure above your own commanding officer?" He looked at me for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted. Not fear, not guilt. Something closer to the look of a man being asked to explain a door he has never been allowed to open. "Because nobody at my level does," he said, "and I've stopped wondering why." Then I asked about the Threl medic. I only asked it because it was on my list, a minor detail buried in the after-action report. During the final exchange of fire at the crossing, a Threl combat medic had been caught in the open, moving toward a fallen soldier, and Cole Bennett's unit had been positioned with a clear line on her position. The report noted, almost as an afterthought, that no shot had been fired at the medic. She had survived. She had treated 3 wounded Threl soldiers and 1 human, under fire, and walked away from the field when it was over. "Is she all right?" Cole asked, before I finished the question. I stopped. I had not been asked a question by a prisoner in over a year of doing this work. Prisoners answered. They did not ask. "The medic," he said again, leaning forward slightly. "Did she make it back to her people?" There was a lot of debris coming down near her position toward the end, and I couldn't see if she— He stopped himself, composed his hands again. "Sorry. That's not something I'm supposed to ask about." Why does it matter to you? Because somebody had to let her through, he said, and it should matter whether that was worth it. I wrote nothing down for almost a full minute. I simply looked at him, because I did not have a framework for what I was looking at. The file said efficient. The file said 0 recorded survivors among those who engaged him directly. And yet here he was, a young man worrying out loud about a stranger from an enemy species he had every justified reason, by the rules of his own war, to have allowed to die in the open. It would have cost him nothing. No one would have questioned it. It was not against any law of war that I knew of, for either side. And he had let her through anyway, and then he had carried the question of whether she lived with him into a prisoner exchange, into a locked room, into a conversation with the one Korvathi officer in the system whose entire job was to look for reasons to distrust him. That was the moment I stopped thinking of him as a weapon and started thinking of him as evidence. Evidence of what? I did not yet have the language to say. I only knew that every report I had ever read about human combat doctrine described a species fighting near the limit of its capability, stretched thin across a dozen borrowed wars, propped up by desperation and numbers and little else. None of those reports accounted for a young man who could have let a stranger die for free and chose, instead, to spend a piece of himself making sure she didn't. Desperate armies do not produce that kind of restraint. Desperate armies produce exhaustion, or cruelty, or both. Cole Bennett produced neither, and I had no box on any form I had ever filled out for what he produced instead. I finished the interview with standard questions, and he answered them the way a trained soldier answers questions he has been told he is allowed to answer, which is to say, carefully and without value. But underneath the careful answers I kept hearing the other thing, the thing that did not fit the file, a restraint that had clearly cost him something to maintain, and that he maintained anyway, alone, in a war his own people had not chosen to end. When the guards came to take him back, he stood, and at the door he turned back toward me. "For what it's worth," he said, "most of us don't want to be good at this." Then he was gone, and I sat alone in a room that smelled faintly of recycled air and metal, staring at a recorder that had captured 40 minutes of a man telling me almost nothing, while somehow telling me everything. That night I wrote a report. I described the prisoner's demeanor, his restraint under direct provocation, his unsolicited concern for an enemy combatant's welfare, and I made the case, as carefully and as professionally as I knew how, that human soldiers were not behaving like an army fighting at the edge of its strength. They were behaving like an army holding something back, like a smaller piece of a larger shape, deliberately dimmed so the rest of the galaxy would only ever see the dim part. I showed an early draft to a colleague before I submitted it, a senior analyst named Owen Carter who had spent more years studying human deployment patterns than I had been alive. He read it twice, standing in the doorway of my office, and handed it back to me without sitting down. "You're reaching," he said. "I'm describing what I saw. You're describing a tired young man who didn't want to talk about a medic. That's not a doctrine. That's a person having a bad day in a locked room." "Then explain the casualty ratios from the crossing," I said. "Explain why every human engagement on record ends with fewer dead on both sides than the model predicts, every single time, across every unit, for 30 years. That's not an accident. That's a pattern, and patterns mean intention." Owen did not have an answer for that, which I noted, and which I should have pushed harder on, and did not, because I was junior and he was not, and because some part of me still wanted to be told I was imagining it. I submitted the report through the proper channels. I received, 3 weeks later, a single line of acknowledgement from a senior analyst who had clearly read only the summary. The line said the observations were noted and filed for future reference. It was filed. It was not read. And somewhere beyond the edge of the systems any of us bothered to map, something patient was already counting the years until it would matter that no one had. The dock light above Lucy Marsh flickered twice before she grabbed my sleeve and pulled me out of it entirely. "Not under the light," she said. "Never under the light." I had been chasing her for 11 days through 3 different stations under 3 different names, and now that I finally had her in a back corridor that smelled of fuel and old metal, she looked less like a smuggler and more like someone who had not slept since the last time she crossed the outer markers. Her hands would not stay still. She kept checking the corridor behind me as though she expected it to change shape. "You said you had something for the Joint Command," I said. "I said I had something for whoever would actually listen, and everyone I tried before you laughed me out of the room." She finally let go of my sleeve. "You're the one who wrote that report, about the soldier and the medic. I read it before they buried it." That stopped me cold, because almost no one had read that report, and the people who had were not in the habit of tracking down half-mad smugglers on fuel docks to discuss it. "I run cargo past the human outer markers," she said. "Past Saul's Edge, where the traffic lanes officially end and nobody official goes. I've made the run 9 times in 6 years. Quiet cargo, nothing anyone would shoot at. And? The 10th time, 6 months ago, I didn't make it past the 8th marker. Her voice dropped low enough that I had to lean in to hear her over the hum of the corridor vents. There was a section of space out there that didn't reflect light right. Not a ship. I know what a cloaked ship looks like. I've smuggled past 3 different Empire stealth patrols and they all leave a trace, a shimmer, a drag on the scanners. This wasn't that. This was just absence, like someone had taken a piece of the dark and made it darker. I asked her how large. My scanners couldn't get a clean edge on it, she said, which is the part that should scare you. I've run cargo past fleets before. I know what a fleet looks like on a scanner even when it's hiding. This didn't read like a fleet. It read like the scanner itself had stopped trusting its own numbers. I did not sleep that night, and not because I doubted her. I did not sleep because some quiet, patient part of my mind had been waiting 6 years for someone to say exactly that. This was the period of my life I would later describe, in private and never in any official record, as the years nobody read. I had been promoted twice since the Bennett interview, mostly because I was competent at the parts of my job that had nothing to do with my obsession, and demoted in influence twice as much because of the parts that did. I kept a private file, separate from anything the Joint Command could access, where I logged every anomaly I could find connecting human military behavior to numbers that did not add up. The first anomaly was population. Earth's registered military-age population, by every census exchanged through diplomatic channels, was a number that should have produced a force roughly a third the size of the human fleets actually observed in combat zones. I checked the math 4 separate times, using 3 different statistical models borrowed from species who had no reason to lie to me, and the gap never closed. Either humans were conscripting children and elders at a rate that would have produced visible social collapse, which it had not, or there were more humans under arms than the population could explain by any honest count. The second anomaly was shipyards, human orbital construction facilities, the ones we were permitted to observe under the terms of 3 separate trade agreements, produced tonnage and hull-grade alloy far beyond what the visible human fleet could account for. I spent 2 years building a private model tracking raw material shipments into those yards against finished vessels shipped out of them, and the gap, again, never closed. Something was being built that nobody outside Sol system was being shown. I remember the night I first ran the full model end-to-end, alone in my apartment, the numbers scrolling across a private terminal I had built myself specifically so the work would never touch a Joint Command server. I expected the gap to close once I accounted for civilian shipbuilding, for maintenance reserves, for the ordinary waste of any large industrial process. It did not close, it widened. Year over year, the alloy entering those yards grew faster than the visible fleet did, as though someone were quietly laying the foundation for a second navy directly beneath the one the rest of us were allowed to count. I sat with that number until the sun came up over the station ring outside my window, and I remember thinking, with a kind of calm that frightened me more than panic would have, that I was looking at the outline of something enormous, traced in nothing but the shadows it left behind. The third anomaly was the soldiers themselves, the ones who survived their tours, human veterans, by every treaty and trade record I could access, simply stopped appearing in public registries after their service ended. Not died, not retired into visible civilian life. Vanished from the data, the way a number vanishes from a ledger once it has been moved to an account you are not permitted to view. I interviewed defectors when I could find them, which was rare, because very few humans defected, and the ones who did were almost never combat veterans. I found a former logistics technician named Daniel Reese, a man who had left Earth's service after a non-combat injury and settled on a neutral station under a different name, and he agreed to speak with me only because I paid him in a currency that could not be traced back to any government account. I loaded supply manifests for 4 years, he told me, in a small rented room that smelled of recycled coffee substitute. I never saw combat. I saw numbers, and the numbers I loaded for visible deployment were never the only numbers I saw move through the system. There was a second column, smaller font, different requisition code, routed through a command structure that didn't match anything in the public org chart. I asked about it once. What happened? I got reassigned to a different terminal the next day. Nobody yelled at me, nobody threatened me. They just smiled and moved me somewhere I couldn't see that column anymore. He shrugged, the particular shrug of a man who had decided a long time ago not to be afraid of something he could not change. That's the part that should worry you more than if they'd yelled. People who yell are improvising. People who smile and reassign you have a plan. I brought this to my superior, a senior commander named Henry Sutton. Sutton had been kind to me early in my career, the sort of mentor who corrects your reports in the margins instead of in front of the room, and he had grown steadily less kind as my private obsession became harder to separate from my professional work. He listened to my summary of the population gap, the shipyard tonnage, the vanishing veterans, and the absence Lucy Marsh had described, and he folded his hands on his desk in a gesture that reminded me, uncomfortably, of Cole Bennett folding his own hands in an interrogation room years earlier. "Vashtek," he said, "you have built an entire career on a single conversation with a tired prisoner. I've built an entire career on 3 independent datasets that all point the same direction. You've built a theory and then gone looking for evidence to feed it. That's not analysis. That's a hobby with a security clearance attached. Then explain the shipyards." "I don't have to explain the shipyards," he said. "Nobody at my level has to explain anything to you. You're not senior enough to be taken this seriously. And frankly, the longer you push this, the less senior you're going to become." It was the closest thing to a direct threat he had ever given me, and I understood it for what it was. I had a choice in that moment. The kind of small private choice that does not feel large until decades later, when you can look back and see it as the hinge everything else swung on. I could let the obsession go, accept the promotions that were still technically available to me, if I stopped asking inconvenient questions, and live a comfortable, well-regarded career studying things that did not threaten anyone's comfortable assumptions. I did not let it go. The consequences were quiet and exact, the way Sutton's consequences always were. My clearance level was reduced by 1 tier within the month, citing a routine reorganization that affected, as far as I could tell, only my desk. My requests for shipyard observation data began returning slower, then incomplete, then eventually a polite note, explaining that the data had been reclassified pending review. I was moved from the analysis floor to a smaller office 2 corridors away, closer to the archive, further from anyone who might ask me what I was working on. None of it was punishment technically. All of it was punishment, practically. I had seen the same pattern described to me once, secondhand, by a frightened defector talking about a column of numbers he was no longer permitted to see. Nobody yells, nobody threatens, they simply move you somewhere quieter, and let the silence do the rest. My marriage ended that same year, quietly, without anger. In the particular way things end when one partner has slowly become a stranger to the other, through nothing more dramatic than absence. My former spouse did not leave because of an argument. There was no single fight to point to, no betrayal, nothing I could have apologized for and fixed. There was only the long accumulation of evenings I spent in my private files instead of at the table, and one day there was simply a door that closed the way doors close when there is nothing left worth raising your voice about. I told myself it was a fair trade. I am no longer certain it was, but I no longer have the standing to argue the other side of that particular case. What I had, instead of a marriage, instead of a career on the track everyone had expected for me, was a growing private file that nobody official would read, and a single new thread from a frightened smuggler that finally, connected to something I could place on a map. Lucy Marsh's absence beyond the 8th marker sat almost precisely along the projected line my shipyard tonnage model had been quietly predicting for 2 years, a line pointing toward a region of space far beyond any system humans had ever formally claimed. I asked her to draw me everything she remembered. The shape of the absence, its rough boundaries, the direction her instruments had drifted before she turned her ship around and ran. She drew it on a scrap of pressed fiber with a stylus that kept slipping in her shaking hand, and when she finished, she pushed it across the table to me, like it was something that might still be listening. "I'm not going back out there," she said, "not for any price you can offer me. I'm not asking you to." "Good." She stood, pulling her jacket tighter around her shoulders even though the corridor was not cold. Because whatever that was, it wasn't hiding from us the way a fleet hides from an enemy. It was hiding from us the way you hide a surprise from a child. Patient, a little bit kind about it even. And I have never in my life been more afraid of kind. She left before I could ask her what she meant by that, and I sat alone in the corridor for a long time afterward, holding a scrap of pressed fiber with a rough, trembling sketch of nothing, understanding for the first time that nothing might be the largest thing I had ever encountered, and that I was the only person in my command structure who believed it was worth being afraid of. I spent the following weeks doing the only thing I knew how to do with fear that nobody else would share. I turned it into a file. I cross-referenced the rough coordinates Lucy Marsh had drawn against my shipyard tonnage projections, against the routing patterns of vanished veterans, against every fragment Daniel Reese had given me about a second column of numbers nobody at his level was permitted to see. The lines did not just intersect, they converged, cleanly, almost elegantly, on a single dark region of space far beyond any border humanity had ever formally claimed, a region with no name on any chart I had access to, a region that, as far as official records were concerned, contained nothing at all. I did not show this final, converged file to Henry Sutton. I did not show it to anyone. I understood, finally and completely, that the people with the authority to act on what I had found were the same people most invested in never having to act on it, because acting on it meant admitting that the species they had spent 30 years using as cheap, expendable soldiers might, in fact, be the most patient and most dangerous power any of us had ever shared a galaxy with. I kept the file. I waited. And I did not have to wait nearly as long as I expected before someone with far less patience than I had decided to test the theory for me. The vote took 11 seconds. I counted them, standing at the back of the council chamber where analysts were permitted to observe but never permitted to speak, watching 11 small lights turn from amber to red across a panel that would decide whether a colony of several thousand human civilians lived through the following week without incident. 11 seconds. For a decision that would later take historians on 6 different worlds decades to fully unravel. "The motion carries," said the council chair, a Threll elder named Soren Vey, who had spent the last hour arguing that humanity's restraint was not patience at all, but weakness, dressed up as patience, and that the only way to know for certain was to test it directly. "Strike authorization is granted, contingent on full deniability. Coordinates to be relayed through neutral proxy forces. No power represented at this table is to be formally connected to the operation." I had been granted a seat in that observation gallery specifically because someone, finally, after years of being filed and ignored, had decided my research was worth consulting before a decision this large was made. I had hoped that meant I would be listened to. I had not understood, until that exact moment, that I had been invited only so the council could say, later, that dissenting analysis had been considered and rejected through proper process. I raised my hand anyway. The chair recognized me with visible reluctance. "This is not a test of restraint," I said. "It's a test of patience, and those are not the same instrument. A people who have shown patience for 30 years are not going to discover their limit on the 31st. They are going to discover that the thing they were waiting for has finally arrived." "Waiting for what, exactly?" Soren Vey asked, in the tone of someone who has already decided the answer does not matter. "I don't know," I said, and I felt the weakness of that answer even as I gave it. That's the entire point. None of us know, and we are about to find out, under conditions we did not choose and cannot control. "We have run this scenario through every predictive model available to this council," Vey said. "Human Earth forces, even accounting for the unaccounted reserves in your own reports, do not possess the capability to retaliate against a coalition this size. Without months of mobilization we would detect well in advance. We are not gambling, Officer Orhaldree. We are testing a hypothesis under controlled conditions, with adequate warning time built into every contingency." "You built your contingencies around the soldiers we've seen," I said. "I have spent 6 years trying to tell this council that the soldiers were never the whole picture. If you strike a human colony to test what they're capable of, you are not testing the fleet I've spent 6 years warning you about. You are testing a fleet that, by definition, none of us have ever seen, which means none of our contingencies account for it at all." The chamber was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of people who have already made their decision, and are simply waiting for the dissent to finish so the agenda can move on. "Your concerns are noted," Soren Vey said, "and the motion stands." To understand why 11 separate powers agreed, in the span of a single afternoon, to gamble an entire colony's safety on a hypothesis about restraint, you have to understand what 30 years of borrowing human soldiers had actually done to the rest of us. We had used them everywhere. Every fading empire at that table had, at some point in the last 3 decades, hired human mercenary units to settle border disputes too costly to fight with our own forces, and every one of those empires had grown quietly, uncomfortably dependent on a species we did not fully understand, and had never bothered to ask permission to depend on. Humans fought our wars cheaply, efficiently, and with a restraint that, in hindsight, none of us had ever properly questioned, because questioning it would have meant admitting we had built a portion of our own security on a foundation we did not control. That dependency had curdled, over the years, into something closer to resentment than gratitude. A power that needs another power's soldiers is a power that has already lost a measure of its own sovereignty, and sovereignty, once a person or a government starts to feel it slipping, has a way of making people reckless in exactly the wrong direction. Soren Vey was not, in my private assessment, a cruel leader. He was a frightened one, presiding over a council of equally frightened leaders, all of whom had spent 3 decades watching a borrowed army win wars too easily, and all of whom had finally convinced themselves that the only way to feel safe again was to find the edge of that army's patience and stand on it themselves. I was escorted from the gallery shortly afterward, not by force, simply by the quiet insistence of an aide who explained that my presence was no longer required for the remainder of the session. I went back to my office, the small one near the archive that Sutton had moved me into years earlier, and I did the only thing left available to me. I watched. The strike was scheduled against a settlement called Calder's Reach, a mid-sized human colony on the edge of a system 3 jumps from Sol, chosen, according to the briefing I was eventually permitted to see, because its defenses were modest, and its political value was high enough to guarantee a response, but not so high that the coalition members felt personally exposed. The proxy force selected to carry out the operation was a coalition of mercenary fleets with deliberately untraceable registries, paid through 3 layers of shell accounts that would, in theory, never lead back to any of the powers who had voted for the strike. I watched the tactical feed from a terminal I was technically not cleared to access, using credentials Owen Carter quietly left active for me before he went home that evening without a word of explanation, the closest thing to an apology he ever gave me for doubting my work years earlier. The feed showed Calder's Reach from high orbit, a modest cluster of domes and agricultural rings spread across a shallow valley, lit gold by a setting sun I had no business finding beautiful, given what I knew was about to happen to it. I watched the proxy fleet drop out of transit at the edge of the system, 11 vessels arranged in a standard suppression formation, and I watched the colony's modest planetary defense grid scramble a response that I already knew, from the briefing numbers, would not be enough. The first wave targeted the colony's orbital communication relay, a strike meant to isolate Calder's Reach from any outside contact before the main force moved against ground-based infrastructure. I watched the relay go dark on my screen, a small red marker blinking out of existence, and I felt something in my chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with my professional distance from the operation, and everything to do with the fact that somewhere beneath that marker, actual people had just lost the ability to call for help. Before the relay went dark, the feed had carried a few seconds of open civilian chatter, the kind of routine traffic that crosses every colony's local channels on any ordinary evening. A woman's voice, calm and unremarkable, reading out a supply manifest to someone on the other end. A child laughing somewhere behind her, too far from the microphone to be more than a soft, distorted sound. I do not know that woman's name. I never will. But I have carried that fragment of her voice with me for the rest of my career, because it was the last entirely ordinary moment Calder's Reach would have for a very long time, and I happened to be the one analyst, 3 jumps away, listening when it ended. The proxy fleet moved against the colony's 2 surface defense platforms next, methodical, almost bored in its efficiency, the kind of attack run executed by mercenaries who had done this exact maneuver against a dozen other unprotected worlds, and felt nothing in particular about doing it again. I watched evacuation alerts begin flashing across civilian channels I had no clearance to monitor but monitored anyway, watched transport shuttles lift away from the agricultural rings in numbers too small and too slow to account for the colony's full population, watched the proxy fleet hold its position rather than press the advantage, almost as if even they understood there was no need to finish what the demonstration had already accomplished. I noted, in the report I would file afterward, and that would, like all my reports, be read by almost no one, that the proxy commanders had been instructed with unusual specificity to avoid casualties wherever the mission allowed it. Whoever had designed this operation wanted a colony that was frightened and undefended, not a colony that was grieving. That detail told me more about the Council's true intentions than anything said aloud in the chamber. They were not trying to punish Calder's Reach. They were trying to send a letter, and they wanted the letter delivered without anything in it that could not later be denied. By the time the operation concluded, 4 hours after it began, Calder's Reach's defense grid had been disabled, its communication relay destroyed, and its population left frightened, isolated, and entirely undefended in a system 3 jumps from the nearest human military presence. The proxy fleet withdrew on schedule, exactly as planned, exactly as deniable as the Council had demanded. And then, nothing happened. I want to be precise about what nothing means in this context, because in the days that followed, several Council members would describe the silence as a victory, proof that the hypothesis had been correct, that human restraint really was simply weakness with better manners. I did not experience the silence that way. I experienced it the way you experience the held breath before a wave breaks against a shore you have not yet seen. A quiet so complete, it stopped feeling like the absence of something, and started feeling like the presence of something else entirely. For the first day, human diplomatic channels said nothing at all. No formal protest, no demand for accountability, no public acknowledgement that Calder's Reach had been struck. I checked every open channel I had access to and found only the colony's own emergency broadcasts, civilians coordinating shelter and supplies among themselves with the calm, practiced efficiency of people who had clearly drilled for exactly this scenario, which told me something the Council's models had apparently never accounted for. This was not the first time these particular humans had prepared for being left alone. On the second day, a single human diplomatic vessel arrived in the Calder's Reach system, unarmed, broadcasting standard humanitarian transponder codes, and began coordinating relief efforts alongside the colonists. No warships, no show of force. No retaliation against the now long-departed proxy fleet, whose registries by that point had already been quietly traced back through 3 deliberately weak layers of obfuscation that any competent investigator would eventually unravel, exactly as the Council had wanted, exactly as deniable as planned, except that the humans never bothered to publicly name the powers responsible at all. They simply showed up, fed people, repaired what could be repaired, and said nothing. I watched the recorded footage of that single vessel's arrival more times than I would like to admit. There was nothing dramatic in it. A modest transport descended through Calder's Reach's damaged atmosphere, settled near the largest of the agricultural rings, and within the hour, its crew was distributing supplies alongside colonists who greeted them not as rescuers, but as something closer to family arriving late to help clean up after a storm. No press statement. No demand for an apology. The restraint in that arrival unsettled me more deeply than the strike itself had, because the strike, at least, had behaved the way I expected violence to behave. The relief effort behaved like something with nothing left to prove, and a power with nothing left to prove is rarely a power that has run out of options. I found that silence far more alarming than any accusation could have been. I went to Henry Sutton on the 3rd day, against my better judgment, against the clear understanding between us that my opinions on this subject were no longer welcome in his office. He saw me anyway, which surprised me, and listened while I laid out what I had watched and what I believed it meant. "You think this is the calm before something larger," he said. "I think the Council just spent 30 years' worth of patience on a single afternoon, and the people who spent that patience have not yet decided what to do about it. That's not relief, Henry, that's a fuse, and we have no way of knowing how long it is." Sutton was quiet for a long moment, turning a stylus over in his fingers, and when he finally spoke, the certainty I had grown used to hearing from him for 30 years had gone entirely out of his voice. "Off the record," he said, "I voted against the strike authorization in the preliminary session, 2 weeks before it reached full council. I was overruled by a margin so wide it wasn't worth recording my dissent formally." He set the stylus down. "I've spent 6 years telling you that your shipyard numbers didn't mean anything. I would like it, very much, if you turned out to be wrong this time." "So would I said, and meant it more than I had meant anything in years. On the 4th day, sensor arrays across a dozen separate systems, operated by a dozen separate powers with no formal communication between them, began registering identical, simultaneous anomalies. Faint gravitational distortions, the kind produced by very large objects in transit, detected at the absolute edge of instrument sensitivity, present for less than a second before vanishing entirely, as though something enormous had paused at the threshold of detection just long enough to be noticed, and then decided, deliberately, to let itself be seen. I was in my office when the first of those readings crossed my terminal, a soft chime I had configured years earlier to alert me to exactly this kind of anomaly, and had genuinely never expected to hear. I sat very still for a long moment, watching the readout repeat itself, smaller and smaller distortions blooming across systems that had nothing in common, except a recent, deniable, supposedly untraceable act of violence against a human colony. I pulled up a star chart and began marking each anomaly as it registered, and within an hour the pattern was undeniable, even to someone who had spent years training herself not to leap toward conclusions. Every flagged location corresponded to a major shipyard, command center, or capital world belonging to one of the 11 powers who had voted in favor of the strike on Calder's Reach. Every single one. Not a single neutral system registered an anomaly. Not a single power who had abstained or voted against the motion appeared anywhere on the chart. Whatever was producing these readings had not simply arrived. It had read the Council's own voting record, and positioned itself accordingly, which meant it had known about the vote before most of the Council's own staff had finished filing the paperwork. I called Owen Carter at an hour, rude enough that he answered already irritated, and irritation dissolved into something closer to dread once I described what I was seeing on my screen. He did not argue with me this time. He did not call it a hobby with a security clearance attached. He simply asked, in a voice gone very quiet, whether I thought we had any time left to prepare for whatever came next. I told him the truth, because there was nothing left to gain from softening it. I did not think preparation was the right word for what we were about to experience. Preparation implies a defense that might work. I did not believe, looking at that chart, that anything any of us had built over the last 30 years was going to be relevant to what was coming. I believed, instead, that we were about to learn the actual shape of the thing we had spent 3 decades mistaking for a tired, borrowed army, and that the lesson was going to arrive whether any of us felt ready for it or not. I did not need 6 more years of unread reports to understand what I was looking at. The silence had never been relief. It had been assembly. And whatever had been quietly gathering itself in the dark beyond the edges of every chart I had ever been permitted to see was no longer waiting to be found. It had decided it was time to arrive. It happened at the same second on 11 different worlds, and I only know that because I checked the timestamps myself. Afterward, when there was finally time to check anything at all. I was standing in the command gallery above the Joint Fleet Operations floor, summoned there by Henry Sutton less than an hour after the sensor anomalies repeated themselves a second time, larger now, impossible to dismiss as instrument error by anyone left in the building. I had no formal authority to be in that gallery. Sutton brought me anyway, and nobody questioned it, because by that point everyone on the operations floor had read enough of my old reports, finally, to understand that I might be the only person in the room who had any idea what they were about to see. The first ship appeared above the primary shipyard orbiting Soren Vey's own homeworld, the one Threll council seat that had pushed hardest for the strike on Calder's Reach. It did not emerge from a transit corridor the way every fleet I had ever studied emerged from a transit corridor, a visible tear in space followed by a controlled bleed of vessels through the opening. It was simply there, all at once, occupying a volume of space that an instant earlier had contained nothing but stars. It had no seams. I want to be precise about that because every hull I had ever studied, human, Threll, Korvathi, every species that had ever built a warship, built it in sections, and the sections left lines, panel breaks, the visible architecture of something assembled rather than grown. This ship had none of that. Its surface moved like a single continuous material, dark and faintly reflective. The way still water reflects a sky it is not actually part of. It carried no visible weapon ports, no sensor arrays, nothing that announced its purpose the way every warship I had ever studied announced its purpose by its shape alone. It simply sat in orbit, vast and quiet, and somehow that quiet was more frightening than any weapon I had ever seen mounted on a hull. I found myself, in that first long moment of looking at it, fixed on a small detail that had no tactical value whatsoever. A console technician 2 rows below me had been holding a cup of recycled tea when the alert sounded, and she had set it down so abruptly that a thin line of liquid had crept across her station and was now dripping, slowly, steadily, onto the floor, and nobody around her had noticed enough to care. I watched that small spreading stain longer than I watched the ship itself, because some part of my mind had simply refused, for those first few seconds, to process anything larger than a cup of spilled tea. I understood, later, that this was simply what fear did to a trained analyst's attention. It did not announce itself with panic. It just narrowed the world down to something small enough to hold. Confirmed scale, someone on the operations floor said, voice tight. Scale confirmed, came the reply, a few seconds later, in a voice that had clearly run the same number twice because it did not believe it the first time. Comparable to the largest orbital shipyard structure currently in operation, it's not a ship, it's a city that decided to move. The second ship appeared above a human colony I had never heard of before that day, and the third above a major Korvathi trade hub 3 systems from my own homeworld, and within the span of perhaps 4 seconds, identical vessels had taken position above every major shipyard, capital world, and command center belonging to one of the 11 powers who had voted for the strike on Calder's Reach. 11 ships, 11 targets, chosen with a precision that made the Council's own deniable, untraceable operation look amateurish by comparison, because where the Council had hidden behind proxies and shell accounts, this fleet had simply gone directly to every responsible party at once, without explanation, without warning, without the faintest gesture toward deniability. I understood, watching the tactical display update in real time, that I was looking at the thing my 6 years of unread reports had been describing all along, not a larger version of the soldiers I had studied, something else entirely, built in the same patient silence, finally standing in full view of everyone who had spent 30 years assuming silence meant absence. The operations floor went, for several long seconds, almost entirely quiet, the particular quiet of a room full of trained professionals, discovering, all at once, that none of their training applied to what was currently on their screens. Then the ship above Soren Vey's homeworld moved. It did not fire in the way I expected weapons fire to look, a visible bolt or beam crossing open space toward a target. Something simply changed in the shipyard's power grid, a cascade of system failures rippling outward from the primary reactor core in a pattern too clean, too deliberate, to be anything other than intentional, and within 90 seconds the entire facility had gone dark, every active weapon system disabled, every drive core offline, the whole structure rendered harmless and intact, with no visible damage to the hull, no breach, no loss of structural integrity that would have endangered the technicians and engineers still inside it. Casualties? Sutton asked, his voice carefully level in a way I recognized as effort rather than calm. None reported, came the answer, and I watched the surprise of that answer pass through the room like a current. Repeat, 0 casualties. Facility is dark and disabled but fully intact. Personnel are confirmed alive and largely unharmed. I thought, standing there, of Lucy Marsh on that fuel dock years earlier, pulling her jacket tight around her shoulders and telling me she had never in her life been more afraid of kind. I had not fully understood what she meant at the time. I understood it now, watching 11 ships choose precision over devastation, watching them prove a point without taking a single life in the proving. Kindness, applied by something powerful enough not to need it, is its own kind of warning. It tells you the worst outcome was available the entire time, and was set aside on purpose, by a will patient enough to wait 30 years for the moment that would make the lesson land hardest. The same pattern repeated at every other location, world after world, the reports arriving faster than anyone could fully process them. Capital defense grids disabled without a single life lost, fleet command centers rendered inert, every weapon system offline, every drive core silent, while the buildings themselves stood untouched and the people inside them walked out, frightened but whole, into a silence that none of them had any framework for understanding. I watched footage later, recovered from a dozen different sources, of soldiers standing in disabled command bunkers staring up at ships that could have erased them entirely, and had instead simply turned off their ability to fight, with the same careful, surgical restraint Cole Bennett had shown a Threll medic standing in the open 30 years earlier. A young communications officer near the front of the operations floor, a Korvathi named Edward Lowry who I had spoken with only twice before that day, turned around at one point with an expression I will remember for the rest of my life. The look of someone watching their entire understanding of the universe rearrange itself in real time. They could have taken the whole shipyard, he said, to no one in particular. Every reactor on that station was running hot enough to level the surrounding orbital ring if they'd wanted a real demonstration. They didn't even scorch the paint. That's the demonstration, I told him. The restraint is the message. They wanted you to understand exactly how much worse this could have been, and they wanted you to understand it without anyone needing to grieve to learn the lesson. He did not have an answer for that, and I did not blame him. I had spent 6 years building toward that single sentence, and saying it out loud finally, to someone who believed me, felt less like vindication than I had once imagined it would. It mostly just felt heavy. It was not mercy exactly. I want to be careful with that word, because mercy implies a choice made out of compassion for the person being spared, and I do not believe compassion was the primary motive on display that day. It was something closer to precision, the kind of precision that comes from having calculated exactly how much force a demonstration requires, and refusing, deliberately, to spend a single unit more than necessary. It was restraint as a statement, restraint loud enough to be heard across a dozen systems without a single shot needing to land where it would actually hurt someone. I thought, standing in that gallery watching the reports come in, of every casualty model I had ever built trying to explain why human engagement statistics never matched the predicted numbers. I had spent years treating that restraint as an anomaly worth investigating. I understood now that I had been looking at a smaller, dimmer version of exactly this, scaled down to the size of a single soldier in a single border conflict, because the larger version had not yet been ready to be seen. The operations floor around me had gone from disciplined silence to something closer to barely controlled fear, officers speaking in clipped, careful sentences, requesting confirmation after confirmation, as though repetition might eventually produce a different, less impossible answer. Sutton stood beside me, watching the same tactical display I was watching, and after a long moment he spoke without turning his head. "Your file," he said. "The shipyard tonnage model. How far off was your final estimate, compared to what we're looking at right now?" I did not need to check my old numbers to answer him. I had carried that gap in my head for 6 years, the way you carry a wound that never quite finishes healing. "I estimated a fleet roughly 4 times the size of Earth's visible forces," I said. "Looking at what just appeared above 11 separate worlds in the same 4 seconds, I think I was conservative by an order of magnitude, possibly more." Sutton did not answer that. There was nothing useful left to say to it. The 11 ships did not press their advantage. They did not move against undefended civilian populations, did not demand surrender, did not broadcast any ultimatum at all. Having disabled the military capacity of every power responsible for the strike on Calder's Reach, they simply held position, dark and silent and impossibly patient, exactly as they had held position somewhere beyond every chart any of us had ever been permitted to see for the entire 30 years it had taken to build them. Word of what had happened spread across every inhabited system within hours, faster than any official channel could control or shape it, because there is no deniability available for a city-sized ship sitting motionless above your own capital world. Markets across a dozen systems closed within the day. Diplomatic channels that had gone quiet during the strike on Calder's Reach now flooded with traffic. Every power not directly targeted scrambling to determine whether they too had quietly crossed some line they had never known existed. I watched broadcast after broadcast from neutral systems. Analysts far less informed than I was speculating wildly about invasion, about annihilation, about 100 outcomes that never arrived, because the 11 ships simply continued to do nothing at all beyond existing, visibly, undeniably, exactly where they had appeared. I think that stillness frightened people more than an attack would have. An attack has a shape. It begins, it does damage, it ends, and survivors can measure themselves against it and begin the long work of rebuilding. Stillness offers nothing to measure. It simply waits, and in waiting, it forces everyone beneath it to sit with the full weight of what could happen next, for as long as it chooses to let that uncertainty stretch. The message, if it could be called a message, required no translation. It had been delivered in the same language human soldiers had been quietly speaking in every border conflict for 3 decades, the language of force held deliberately, visibly, almost generously in check. We had spent 30 years mistaking that language for weakness. Standing in that gallery, watching 11 impossible ships sit in patient silence above the shattered confidence of every power that had voted to test them, I understood, finally and completely, that we had simply never been fluent enough to hear what they had been saying all along. I stayed in that gallery long after most of the operations floor had been dismissed, to draft preliminary reports nobody yet had the language to write properly. Sutton stayed with me, the two of us watching the tactical display long after it had stopped changing, the 11 markers fixed and unmoving above 11 worlds that would never again describe themselves as secure in quite the same way. Neither of us spoke for a long time. There did not seem to be anything left worth saying that the silence on the screen had not already said more completely than either of us could manage. Eventually Sutton broke the quiet, his voice rough in a way I had never heard from him before, not even in our worst arguments over the years I had spent pushing a theory he refused to believe. 30 years, he said. 30 years we used them, paid them, sent them out to die in our wars, and called it a fair trade because they never asked for anything we weren't willing to give. He shook his head slowly. I keep thinking about what kind of patience that takes. To let yourself be used like that, on purpose, for 3 decades, and never once let the mask slip. It wasn't a mask, I said. And even as I said it, I understood it was the truest thing I had said in 6 years. A mask is something you wear to hide what you actually are. I don't think this was ever hiding anything. I think it was simply waiting for the rest of us to be ready to see it, and willing to spend 30 years giving us every chance to look properly before it had to show us directly. Sutton did not answer that. Below us, the 11 markers held their positions, patient and unmoving, and somewhere among them, I was certain, was an answer to a question I had been asking since the day I sat across a table from a young man who had asked, before anything else, whether a stranger he had spared was all right. My name was on the delegation list before I had finished reading the rest of it, which told me everything I needed to know about how quickly the Council's priorities had reorganized themselves in the 4 days since the 11 ships arrived. Soren Vey was no longer chair. He had resigned within 48 hours, citing reasons the official record described as personal, and that everyone privately understood as something closer to disgrace. The new acting chair, a cautious, careful Korvathi administrator with no history of pushing for the strike, had assembled a small delegation tasked with making formal first contact with whatever command structure stood behind the 11 ships, and Henry Sutton had put my name forward without asking me first, which I forgave him for almost immediately once I understood why. "You're the only person in this command structure who spent 30 years actually listening," he told me, the night before we departed. "If anyone is going to walk into that room and not say something that gets the rest of us killed, it's you." I did not feel as confident as he sounded. I had spent 30 years gathering evidence about a force I had never expected to meet face to face, and evidence, I had learned by then, was not the same thing as understanding. The meeting point was a single human vessel, modest in size compared to the 11 impossible ships still holding silent position above a dozen worlds, stationed at a neutral coordinate, equidistant from every power involved in the strike on Calder's Reach. Our small delegation crossed over in a shuttle barely large enough for the 5 of us and our 2 security escorts, and I remember the crossing itself as one of the longest silences of my life. Nobody speaking, everyone watching the human vessel grow larger on the viewport, none of us entirely certain what kind of welcome, if any, was waiting for us on the other side. One of the younger delegates, a Threll trade liaison who had said almost nothing since we departed, finally broke the silence about halfway through the crossing. "Do you think they'll want an apology?" she asked, to no one in particular, "or do you think it's already too late for one to matter?" Nobody answered her, because none of us actually knew, and I found myself thinking, instead, of the small handwritten note I did not yet know I would be carrying home in my pocket, of a young soldier folding his hands gently on a table 30 years earlier, asking after a stranger's welfare before he asked anything else. I did not think Earth wanted an apology exactly, I thought, watching that quiet, unremarkable vessel grow larger against the dark, that what they had always wanted was simply to be seen accurately, for the first time, by people who had spent 30 years finding it more convenient not to look too closely. The vessel's interior, when we finally boarded, was almost disappointingly ordinary. Clean corridors, practical lighting, the kind of unremarkable military architecture I had walked through 100 times on a dozen different ships belonging to a dozen different powers. I do not know what I expected. Something grander, perhaps. Some visible proof of the technology that had disabled 11 shipyards without a single recorded casualty. Instead, I found function without ornament, a ship built by people who had apparently never felt the need to decorate their power, only to use it precisely, and then walk away. We were met by a small honor escort and led to a conference room with a single long table, and I was midway through composing the opening statement I had rehearsed on the shuttle, when the door at the far end opened, and a man walked in wearing the insignia of a fleet commander, and every prepared sentence I had ready left my mind at once. It was Cole Bennett. He was older, the way 30 years makes anyone older, gray threading through hair that had been dark the last time I saw him, lines at the corners of eyes that had once looked at me with nothing but careful, guarded calm. But it was unmistakably him, the same young man who had asked, before anything else, whether a Threll medic had made it home safely, now standing in front of me wearing the rank of someone who clearly commanded a great deal more than the single infantry unit he had once belonged to. "Officer Orhal Dree," he said, and there was something almost gentle in the way he said it, a recognition that carried none of the satisfaction I might have expected from someone finally being proven right after 30 years of being dismissed. "I read your first report, the one about the medic." "I assumed nobody read that report," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. "Almost nobody did," he agreed. "I made sure I was one of the exceptions." He gestured for me to sit, and took the seat across from me, the same arrangement, oddly, as the interrogation room 30 years earlier, except this time neither of us was a prisoner, and neither of us needed to perform anything for a recorder between us. "You were the only analyst in 30 years who looked at what we were doing and asked the right question. Everyone else asked how dangerous we were. You asked what we were holding back and why." "And the answer?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of someone choosing which true thing to say first, out of many true things available to him. "The soldiers were never meant to be the whole answer," he said. "They were meant to be seen, feared a little, respected a little, never fully understood. Just enough to buy the rest of us the decades we needed to finish building something that would never have to be feared twice." He folded his hands on the table, the same gesture I remembered from 30 years earlier, and I understood now that it was not a performance of calm. It was simply how he thought. Earth made a choice a long time ago, before either of us were born, that we would never again let ourselves be a power that had to prove its strength through use. We decided strength only mattered if it could afford to be patient, so we sent the smallest, most visible piece of ourselves out into the galaxy first, let the rest of you build 30 years of assumptions about what we were capable of, and spent that same 30 years finishing the part you were never supposed to see until the day it actually mattered. And Calder's Reach was the day it mattered. Calder's Reach was the day someone decided to find out where the edge of our patience actually was, he said. We'd have preferred they never asked. We built the silent fleet hoping it would never need to introduce itself. But a question like that, once it's asked out loud, in front of a colony full of people who never agreed to be part of anyone's hypothesis, deserves an answer clear enough that nobody asks it again. I thought about the 11 disabled shipyards, the 0 casualties, the careful, surgical precision of a demonstration that could have been so much worse and chose, deliberately, not to be. You could have done far more damage, I said. Nobody would have stopped you. That was never the point, Cole said. If we'd wanted to win a war, we would have fought one 30 years ago. The easy way, with the soldiers everyone already feared. We didn't build the silent fleet to win a war. We built it so a war would never need to happen again, and the only way that works is if the demonstration is loud enough to be believed and restrained enough that nobody mistakes restraint for an invitation to test us a second time. I told him then about Lucy Marsh, the frightened smuggler who had nearly run her ship straight into the edge of whatever had been gathering beyond the 8th marker, who had described an absence in the dark that her scanners could not put an edge on. I asked him whether that encounter had been an accident, a stray patrol vessel briefly visible at the wrong moment, or something else entirely. Cole considered the question for a moment before answering. Nothing about the silent fleet's positioning was ever an accident, he said. We tracked every vessel that came close enough to notice something was there. Most of them never noticed. The ones who did, we let go, every time, because frightening one smuggler badly enough that she stopped running that route was always cheaper than the alternative, and because we never wanted our first real contact with anyone to happen by force. He paused. Tell her if you ever see her again, that she was right to be afraid, And tell her she was also right that it wasn't the kind of fear that should have made her stop trusting her own instincts. Those instincts are exactly what kept her alive. I sat with that for a long moment, turning over 30 years of my own career. The marriage I had let dissolve in pursuit of a theory nobody wanted to hear. The years spent in a smaller office near the archive. The quiet, patient accumulation of evidence that had finally, arrived at a truth too large to argue with. I had spent my entire professional life convinced that I was uncovering a secret. Sitting across from Cole Bennett, I understood, with a kind of vertigo I had not expected, that I had never been uncovering anything. I had simply been one of the very few people patient enough to notice that the secret had never actually been hidden. It had been standing in plain sight the entire time, dimmed on purpose, waiting for the rest of us to be ready to look at it directly. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now," Cole said. "Earth negotiates new terms with every power that participated in the strike. Not punishment, not occupation. Reparations to Calder's Reach, full transparency requirements going forward, and a permanent seat for Earth at every council table that used to debate our fate without inviting us into the room." He paused. "And eventually, when enough time has passed that it won't look like a threat, we'll probably stop hiding the rest of what we built. Not because we want anyone to be afraid of it, because secrecy was never the goal. Readiness was. And we're not in a hurry to be misunderstood as something we're not, the way our own soldiers were misunderstood for 30 years. I asked him, before the meeting concluded, about the Threll medic, the one whose welfare he had asked after in a locked room 3 decades earlier, because some part of me needed to know that the thread connecting that first conversation to this one had not simply been a coincidence I had built a career imagining meaning into. "She's alive," he said, and for the first time since he had walked into the room, something in his composed expression softened into something closer to genuine warmth. "She runs a medical relief network now, across a dozen systems. We've funded part of it, quietly, for years. I like to think that's the kind of thing the restraint was always supposed to be for. Not the absence of war. The presence of everything war would have cost us instead." The delegation concluded its formal business an hour later, terms exchanged, schedules set for the longer negotiations that would follow over the coming months, and I left that ship with a single handwritten note in my pocket, given to me by Cole Bennett at the door, that I did not open until I was alone in my quarters on the journey home. It read, in plain, simple handwriting, "Thank you for being the one who actually read the file." The journey back felt different from the journey out. Where the crossing toward the human vessel had been thick with uncertainty, the return felt almost weightless, the particular lightness that comes after carrying something heavy for so long that you forget, until it is gone, how much it had been pressing on you. I did not speak much to the rest of the delegation. I sat near the viewport, watching the 11 distant markers still holding their patient, unmoving positions across the star charts, and I thought about how strange it was to finally feel relief and grief arrive at almost exactly the same moment. Henry Sutton met me at the docking bay when we returned, which surprised me, since meeting returning delegations in person was well beneath the dignity most senior commanders preserved for themselves. He did not ask me how the meeting went. He simply looked at my face for a long moment, the way an old friend looks at someone they have watched carry something difficult for a very long time, and said only, "You look like someone who finally got to put something down." "I think I did," I told him. "Was it worth it?" he asked. 30 years of being right and almost nobody listening. Was it worth it, now that they finally are? I did not answer him immediately, because I did not yet know the honest answer, and I had spent enough of my career giving careful, honest answers that I was not willing to start giving careless ones now, not even to a friend. "I don't know yet," I said. "Ask me again once I've finished the report." I did not write a report when I returned. Not at first. I sat for 3 full days with everything I had gathered over 30 years, every shipyard model, every defector interview, every unread submission that had once been filed and forgotten, and I understood that the report I had always meant to write, the one warning everyone how dangerous humanity might be, was no longer the report that needed writing. What I wrote instead was simpler, and it was, for the first time in my career, read by everyone who mattered, because by then, everyone finally understood there was a reason to read it. I wrote that humanity had never been the danger the galaxy spent 30 years fearing. I wrote that the actual danger had always been our own unwillingness to ask, honestly and early, what a quiet, patient species might be capable of when it finally stopped being underestimated. I wrote that the lesson of the Silent Fleet was not that humans were powerful, though they were. More powerful than any model I had ever built came close to predicting. The lesson was that power, held with enough discipline and enough patience, does not need to announce itself loudly to be the most important fact in the room. I sent a copy of the final report to Owen Carter, the colleague who had once stood in my doorway and called my early theories a reach. and a separate copy, addressed personally, to Daniel Reese, the defector technician who had given me the first real thread to pull on, all those years before anyone else thought the thread was worth following. I do not know if either of them ever read it in full. I like to imagine they did, if only because both of them, in their own quiet ways, had given me a piece of the patience this entire story had ultimately turned out to be about. I think of Cole Bennett's hands, folded gently on a table 30 years apart, in two very different rooms, and I think of how little, in the end, that gesture had ever actually changed. The same patience, the same restraint, the same quiet, careful concern for a stranger he had no obligation to spare. I had spent 30 years trying to prove that humanity was something to fear. I understand now that I was only ever half right, and that the half I had wrong was the half that mattered most. I am older now than Sutton was when he first warned me about the cost of pursuing this obsession, and I have had a long time since that day to consider what I would tell a younger version of myself, sitting alone in a locked room across from a tired young soldier, certain only that something about him did not fit the file. I think I would tell her to trust that discomfort sooner, and to expect, gently, that almost nobody around her would trust it with her, not for a very long time, and that this would not make the discomfort any less true. Patience, I have learned, is rarely rewarded on a schedule that feels fair to the person practicing it. It is only ever rewarded, if it is rewarded at all, decades later, by people who were not yet born to thank you for it. The galaxy did not need to fear human soldiers. It needed, all along, to listen to what their restraint had been trying to tell us, and I am no longer certain any of us were ever as afraid of the silence as we should have been.